Okay.
Okay, welcome everybody. So I'm going to cover or just give a review of chapter 13, the value of life. And I don't have a slideshow this time, but I prepared something I'm going to read from, kind of elaborate from. Steiner opens the chapter by contrasting, what he's calling the optimistic take on the value of life with the pessimistic. And so, he refers to Leibniz and I guess Shaftesbury when he mentions the optimistic take, which is kind of this vision of God is good, the world is good, evil is just privation, it's not really real. And from a higher perspective, it somehow gets woven into the divine plan. And so this is the best of possible worlds, and life has value. Our participation has value because of this. Whereas pessimists, and his two examples are Schopenhauer and then Hartmann, who he primarily takes as his interlocutor in this chapter. But for Schopenhauer, which he kind of describes as a passive pessimism, there's the belief or the perspective is that striving, our ceaseless striving, is what brings us suffering. I wonder if Schopenhauer was particularly influenced by any kind of Buddhist or Eastern philosophies in this regard. I don't know if that's true or not, but so there's this belief that non-existence would be preferable to existence because existence is, the striving brings suffering. So there's this ideal in cessation through which Steiner refers to as a universal idleness. So that's why he describes it as a passive pessimism. But Steiner disagrees, as we'll have read, that striving to attain our desires is itself painful. Rather, he points out that we can actually derive pleasure from the striving, and it's actually the lack of fulfillment, and even maybe the impossibility of fulfillment that is what causes pain and may even, I guess, encourage us to resign altogether. Um, and yeah, so his primary chapter, though, or primary example is Hartmann, and which he describes as a kind of active pessimism. And as we've seen, in the past chapter, this is connected with Hartmann's, sort of metaphysics. So according to Steiner, Hartmann comes to the conclusion that non-existence is preferable to existence because if we survey experience rationally, so according to reason, we can see, according to Hartmann, there is a surplus of pain over pleasure in life. So he's indexing the value of life to this would-be surplus of pleasure. Hartmann's, according to Steiner, I haven't read Hartmann, so I don't actually know the ins and outs of his thought, but Hartmann says that anyone can arrive at this conclusion through rationally assessing the balance of pain and pleasure. Once we see through the illusory pleasures of our egoic striving, we ought to renounce desire and the enjoyment of pleasures and instead submit ourselves to the extra human, so not derived out of our conscious intentions, purpose of God's redemption. And this is the moral life for Hartmann. So earlier in the book, Steiner summarized Hartmann's overall philosophy as one which sees the world process as this passion of the incarnated Godhead. So this means of overcoming or ceasing the suffering of God. And so we exist, and the whole cosmic process exists to serve in the extinguishing of God's suffering by bringing about the redemption, which is like a kind of non-existence. This participation in the eschatological world process is what makes his pessimism active for Steiner. And in chapter 10, Steiner describes Hartmann as a spiritual dualist because he defines the moral life of human beings according to extra human purposes. So like in a similar way that the metaphysical realist would look for realities behind the phenomena, Hartmann is pointing to purposes beyond what human beings consciously intend for themselves. And so this is for Steiner, this notion of the selfless submission to God's redemption, as the actual purpose of human beings, thereby renders the human a slave to the will of the absolute. So a kind of like spiritual automaton. And as Steiner argued in chapter 11, truly purposeful action can only arise through the consciously willed deeds of individual human beings in concrete circumstances. So what Hartman argues for is against this ideal of freedom. So for Steiner, the wanting of the will, our desire and the satisfaction connected with the fulfillment of our ideals, this desire to realize our moral ideals is a factor at play in free deeds. Otherwise, we act out of compulsion or instinct. And so Steiner, throughout this chapter, deconstructs Harman's method, or his take, and he starts with his method for determining the value of life by questioning whether reason is actually capable of measuring pleasure and pain. And so, as he writes, whoever ascribes a lesser value for life to pleasure that is based on an illusion, these pleasures aren't as valuable because they're actually illusory. They're just like your egoic indulgences. And so this, what Hartman does when he kind of points to like the extra human purpose. Steiner says, whoever ascribes a lesser value for life to a pleasure that is based on an illusion that can justify itself before the tribunal of reason makes the value of life dependent on factors other than pleasure. So he's saying that we can't really take Hartman's, method seriously because it's applying applying reason to pleasure in a way that distorts the actual feeling experience of pleasure. And so Steiner's always trying to bring us back to our experience. And so Steiner says, if we were true to our experience, we would recognize that, for example, there are many more who tenaciously endure, the intense suffering of their lives than commit suicide. And so if we stay within feeling rather than just a kind of like, view from nowhere rational assessment of pleasure, when attempting to measure, we can see that not only do we derive pleasure from striving to attain what we desire, but that enduring pain can intensify the pleasure we receive if we are able to fulfill our goals. And so, what motivates us to continue living, is not just an expectation for a surplus of pleasure, but there's like a kind of, we're concretely in the midst of our experience, and our satisfactions are oriented toward very specific goals. And hope of satisfaction, despite the odds, Steiner says, is the foundation of all human striving. So rather than determine the value of life by discerning whether there is a surplus of pain and pleasure, Steiner argues that there is a more indirect connection. And so instead, it's the intensity of our desire measured against the pain entailed in attaining our goal that determines the value of pleasure. And, our sense of like, is life worth living, or is this worth aspiring to, whatever this might be, this particular aspiration. This familiar phrase, is it worth it? It conveys the way in which we measure, what we hope to achieve with, the strife that it takes to achieve it. And so if the pain is too much to bear, then our striving may seem pointless. And towards the end of the chapter, he kind of, in a way echoes the former chapter where we're talking about, or maybe it was the chapter before that, about evolution, how, this potential for free action is emerging up out of nature. And so we're in continuity with nature. Also in this experience of striving, beyond the odds, beyond, the surplus of suffering in the world. So as Steiner writes, all existing life strives to express itself, and only that part of it whose desires are smothered by the overwhelming weight of difficulties abandons the struggle. So determining the value of life based on the surplus of a generalized sense of pleasure does not reflect our actual circumstances, Steiner argues. So desire rather than the ideal of a surplus of pleasure is the original measure of our wills, like how intense is our desire. And it is typically aimed at, as I mentioned before, concrete particular goals. We do not achieve satisfaction by aiming at kind of generalized happiness abstracted from our concrete striving, which is interesting to think about, because this was over 100 years ago. And I think that sense that we should be happy or or that we're aiming at a kind of generalized happiness is kind of widespread today, as is like the availability of easy indulgences. As Steiner writes, pessimistic ethics believes that it must present the pursuit of happiness as an impossibility for man in order that he may devote himself to his proper moral tasks. But these moral tasks are nothing but the concrete, natural, and spiritual instincts, and man strives to satisfy them in spite of the incidental pain. The pursuit of happiness that the pessimist would eradicate is therefore nowhere to be found. But the tasks which man has to fulfill, he does fulfill, because from the very nature of his being, he wants to fulfill them once he has properly understood their nature. And then further on, he says, what we call good is not what a person must do, but what he will want to do if he develops the true nature of man to the full. So again, he's like bringing us back to our actual experience of, desire and desire's connection with, the aspiration for ethical behavior. And so bringing us back to, this potential for consciously intended action and, true morality issuing from that rather than a compulsive following of the extra human purpose that we have not consciously intended for ourselves. And so Steiner wraps up the chapter by arguing that Hartmann's pessimism cannot allow for freedom because it disregards the potential for moral imagination to provide human beings with ideal intuitions which could motivate our striving. And I'm curious to, hear if anybody has thoughts or examples of like moral imaginations or I guess exercises or whatever it might be that provide us in your own experience with the ideals. So if we stoke our desire for the actualization of such intuitions, we can bring the process of natural evolution to a higher level through free action. That's kind of how I think that's what he's proposing. This is the essence of Steiner's ethical individualism, wherethrough we are consistently referred back to ourselves, where, as he writes, true morality is understood to consist in what arises in man. This is at the end. When he develops his moral will as an integral part of his whole being, so that to do what is not moral appears to him as a stunting and crippling of his nature. And this just makes me think of Goethe, and I guess the whole the kind of educational approach or notion of the Bildung. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but this notion that like rather than mutilate our being by imposing a kind of abstract extra-human purpose, what the ideal is to like draw it out of us and to to bring out the nobility of the human at the individual level, where we're like consciously I guess through experience, through our own trials and tribulations, coming to recognize what is actually virtuous and what is dignified for ourselves as human beings. And then I just wanted to end by thinking about or just mentioning that I every now and then I listen to some podcasts that are made by this neuroscientist Andrew Huberman, which he tends to like present things in a materialistic way. But I think the research he's spoken about recently regarding dopamine is interesting if we like read it as a kind of chemical expression of spiritual activity. And so according to Huberman, there's like been a recent reevaluation of dopamine and its role, where it used to be associated just with pleasure, but now it's understood to be more connected with motivation. And so if we overindulge in pleasures that are really easy, ready to hand, like social media or whatever it is, will deplete dopamine. So there are these pleasures that we indulge in that don't require a lot of effort. We deplete dopamine. So this is like, the materialistic sort of construal of it. Or you could put it as like if we indulge in pleasures that don't involve us in any kind of striving, then our motivation to seek after like higher goods that do require a lot of striving is depleted. And so he's like speculating that because we have so much access in a way to like a kind of surplus, easy pleasure, evolution will select for those who are able to buffer themselves from overindulging. But I just think this kind of corroborates what Steiner's saying, to the extent that he speaks about, the surplus of pleasure not being actually something that we've evolved with, and that the human, is made to strive, or that the character of the human, the essence of the human, is to strive. Anyway, just some thoughts connecting Steiner's phenomenology to contemporary neuroscience, and I'll stop there. Thanks for your attention.
Wow, I thought that was fantastic, Ashton, that you captured the whole breadth of this huge chapter wonderfully. And what you brought about Huberman, that's fascinating, because it seems to be doing exactly what you're saying, to corroborate with regular science, I'll say, the value of the striving rather than the pleasure. I find that fantastic.
Yeah, amen. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like we need more people like engaging with sort of good-willed but materialistically inclined thinkers who are communicating science, publicly. Anyway, I'm glad you
Yeah,
thought.
it's true, absolutely. Because if it's true in the terms of this book, it's also true in the body.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. And it's just interesting because he speaks about it like dopamine's doing this, and where we could be talking about how like what we see with the chemistry is reflecting like this, first person experience, or certain kinds of like a moral activity, a spiritual activity. What you thinking, Matt?
Yeah, thanks for that, Ashton. And so upon rereading this chapter, I have to admit it felt a bit tedious to me, because I was not already inclined to take von Hartmann's calculus of pleasure and pain seriously. But it's almost as though Steiner, I mean, in many ways, was writing this book in part to von Hartmann, and particularly this chapter. And he really wanted to convince von Hartmann that he was wrong about this. And he, of course, we know didn't succeed in that. But after spending some time reflecting on it, it struck me that actually nowadays, and you were hinting at this in the sort of cheap pleasures and dopamine hits that are available to us through various technological means and drugs and all sorts of different ways nowadays. It struck me that actually this chapter is extremely relevant. I don't know if any of you have encountered what gets called antinatalism, or elifism, which is like life backwards ism. And the basic idea here is when you just take a rational look at life on Earth, whether in human form or any other form, the argument is that suffering clearly outweighs joy, and that the moral thing to do, if it were possible, would be to eliminate all life and prevent new birth, antinatalism. And I think more and more people are being drawn to this point of view because of, I mean, the state of society and the world right now. We're sort of in a rush to eliminate the future, you could say. And so there's a lot of hopelessness. And when there's hopelessness, there's not much willingness to strive. And so these higher forms of joy that come from striving and the achievement of what is striven for are more and more out of reach for more and more people, right? And I feel like Steiner's, and often these are very rational people, like hyper rational people. And so the tediousness of Steiner's arguments about how, you can't really calculate this and all the reasons why that doesn't quite work and doesn't line up with our phenomenology. I can see how for some of these people, this might actually be really, really important to read. But yeah, I just wanted to just throw that into the mix, that this is so relevant now, more so probably than it was in the late 19th century when Steiner was writing. So
Yeah, it seems like the anti-natalism perspective would also, be definitely assuming, I would imagine, assuming, the a nihilistic perspective of the universe as just being random and meaning, like not having a purpose. And yeah, we're just on a speck of dust and this is absurd. Why we should just kill ourselves. That was what the surrealists thought 100 years ago. Angus?
Yeah, hi. Lots of hands going up. Lots of people want to say stuff. There is so much going on in this chapter. It's really good. If I get a chance to talk again, I'll come back to the exercises question you asked, Ashton. But I wanted to make some other points which I think are really interesting in the context here. You asked the question at the beginning: was Schopenhauer into Oriental thinking? Yep, super big time. Bhagavad Gita, Advaita Advaita Vedanta, which is the emphasis of unity over. So he was very, very steeped in there, in that thinking, and so, and Hartman was also well into his Buddhism as well, and I think I'm going to add another detail, which is like a surprising element in there, but that Oriental thinking, I think, helps us understand why he ended up where he did. But there's like the fly in the ointment, and Matt probably knows about this, was Hartman's work on Schelling's positive philosophy, where basically Hartman reconciled Schelling's positive philosophy with Hegel. I believe that's correct. Let me just check I just want to double check that I'm getting that right. The Hegel and the Schopenhauer, he talked about Schelling's positive response to that in there. So he had found a model, if you like, for reconciling these two polarities in thinking, yet nevertheless he ended in one end of the polarity. This is sort of where I'm arriving at with my thinking. And if we think about Oriental thinking, this world is hugely simplifying, obviously, but for the purposes of this description, this world is Maya, and so there's wanting to escape from this world because the real value isn't here. So what Hartman does, he sets up this metaphysical reality, which is like completely unknowable, just like Schopenhauer, and says, it posits this as like the real point of life, but it's never achievable for us. Therefore, we're doomed to unhappiness. As part of the dynamics of what I see going on here. But the other deeply fascinating part for me here is, I'm going to call it the redeeming of Lucifer, because what is striving? It's a desire. And this is what Steiner's doing in this chapter. It's a real hymn to freedom. It's the turning these what Steiner outside of the philosophy of freedom call luciferic forces, desires, like inner wants, which obviously the Oriental thought has to separate itself up from to reach this nirvana. Here, what Steiner's doing is saying, absolutely, those desires they certainly need purifying, they need cleaning up, they need to be put into the service of humanity, but they certainly shouldn't be suppressed. And that's part of the reason why it's so conciliant with this whole individual freedom, ethical, individualistic aspect that comes really strongly to the fore in this chapter. So I was thinking very much of Pandora's box. It's like striving becomes the hope which actually can save humanity in this. Desire isn't all bad, guys. This is one way of describing what he's saying.
Yeah, I was like, what I call, Steiner's position. I mean, he does kind of describe it as realism throughout the book now and then, but like as this sort of qualified optimism. The sort of incarnational element, acknowledging the suffering, but also acknowledging the real value of being here. and kind of faithfulness to our experience. Lorenzo?
Hello, everybody. I'd like to follow up on the same train of thought of Matt's and of the end of Angus' speech. I'd like to underline the political relevance of this, the radicality of the individualism that Steiner vision is presenting. For example, if we were to push his thoughts and use them to analyze what we see happening every day during the last years, since for Steiner, value is not logically, he says it's not rationally, but I would prefer to say it's not logically determinable, but because it always depends on the amount of desire that the individual has. We cannot derive policies about what should be right to do on the collective level on a plainly logical basis. If we say, okay, there is an epidemic, for example, and there are people that could die if you walk around freely, we have to take this into account. So you should not be able to walk around, since if we just make the count, the total displeasure, the total, let's say, pain, death, suffering that results from this action is more than the pleasure that you're taking your walk. And since we live in a day where more and more the hypothesis, the starting analysis of the situation is in the hand of power, of structures, of media that we do not control. So the situation is presented to us, we cannot argue with it, and then logical conclusions are derived from it, and this more and more is leading to polarization and what looks like a possible totalitarianism, a kind of collectivism. Well, the Steiner's thought of this chapter really undermines the kind of trap we are in now, because whatever the hypothesis the system gives us, from which logical conclusions can be derived that justify the policies that our governments employ, well, they don't actually matter. You cannot count that way. You cannot determine value just from pleasure and suffering. There is the equation is more complex than that, and there is a part that relies on the individual. So yeah, it's just that I wanted to underline how relevant to our days this chapter is, and how powerful this doctrine could be in undermining the political discourse that we live in. Thanks.
That's such a great application, Lorenzo. You know, just considering, yeah, the all the different approaches that were taken to the pandemic, and how so many of them resulted in a kind of well, dehumanizing of certain parties, and as well, like circumstances that maybe were like less conducive for health, because there was not it because there's like this kind of computer-like assessment of human life and health, even that doesn't take into account the way that the abstract hypothesizing ends up impacting living relationships between human beings and families and friends. And anyway, Max.
Thank you. I would mostly, with my comment, just like to emphasize what Lorenzo said, and maybe add to it a little bit. But I think like many of us, I really appreciate that connection that Lorenzo made. And I think, kind of to reiterate, what Steiner has done in this chapter is pulled the rug out from under, like so many of the departure points for modern decision making that are based in a kind of general utilitarian calculus. And one of the obvious problems with those calculations is they're so conjectural and model based. And the fact is, like, the hypothetical pleasure, it doesn't exist at the time that you have to make the calculation. And this is, I think, something that's implicit in this chapter from Steiner. The thing that's present simultaneously with the pain you're going to have to undergo is desire, and not pleasure. And so it makes no sense to juxtapose something that doesn't exist against something that does concretely exist in the moment. And I can't help but think, especially because today's Thursday, like the Passover day of the Holy Week, I can't help but think of two episodes from the Gospels. One, of course, is Caiaphas, the chief priest, who basically is like the archetypal utilitarian politician, and he has the comment like something along the lines of, "Ye know nothing at all, nor consider that it is expedient that one man should die for the sake of the nation." So it's again this sort of general attempt to apply the utilitarian calculus that is, as Steiner points out, it's very far from how life actually is. But nevertheless, we see it's a constant. It's like a constant struggle because of how tempting it can be. The other scene that comes to mind, of course, is when Mary is anointing Christ's feet with oil, and then I have the passage here. Judas Iscariot, which should betray him, comes and says, "Why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence and given to the poor?" This is what Judas says. Then he said that he said not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief. Anyway, this is John the Evangelist's gloss on it. But then Jesus says, "Let her alone. Again, this is the day of my burial with ye, but me ye have not always." And I think that it presents this image of how the image of these like intellectuals that are saving the world with their abstract calculations while, you know, kind of completely ignoring what is right before them. And so once again, I think Steiner is calling us away from that. I don't know if that's more of like an Ahrimanic temptation than a Luciferic one, but I think he's, as always, calling us into the center. So thank you. And again, thanks to Lorenzo. I really appreciated the connection he made.
Amen. Thank you, Max. Jeff?
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to speak very much. I really appreciate this group and what you've done to bring this chapter to life for me. It's always been a pain in my ass. I hated it for its mathematism and its accounting and its but I'm going to give way to Kate in a minute because she's going to say everything that I meant to say in the first place anyway. So, and she's going to say it better than I could. But I think of a couple of things, and that's the suffering of Nietzsche, and the burden that Steiner himself must have carried, knowing what von Hartmann was bringing about for himself, and in a way for humanity, because of this idiotic concept of the unconscious and this breeding of a kind of cynicism that would be permanent. And it's really heartbreaking. But excuse me. But then I think ultimately, of course, as Max brought, of the knowing task of the kind of suffering that would have to occur, that the Christ willingly gave himself to. So I'm going to leave that there.
Appreciate your vulnerability, Jeff. Always deep feeling. Kate, would you like to speak?
Thank you, everyone. Everyone has been doing such amazing shares. I've been trying to write everything down. And thank you, Jeff, for your kind words about me. I don't think it's true, but I'll try my best. I was thinking about how, as Lorenzo talked about politics, I want to talk about education, because right in the right in the seed of vegetarianism, where striving and genuine wish to know that children have is wow, I want to cry too, is just destroyed by the teachers being like, well, this is what you need for the exams. And you know, people do that in a kind way, but I always found it so just like, it was just irreconcilable with me that you would take a class for the utilitarian purpose of passing it so that you can have the proof that you passed it. And all of these problems that people talk about, what's it called? The AI thing, the AI guy, ChatGPT, that, well, you know, is the problems that it poses for education. Those problems only exist because no one believes that a child genuinely wants to know and strives to know, and that all they want is just to cheat and get their way into it. And who put that idea in their head except the teachers, who said, this is what you need for the test? And when I ask questions, and when children ask questions, and teenagers and young people ask questions, because I'm studying right now, and I ask questions, and the teachers, it breaks my heart when I see that the teachers don't know how to respond to that, because they've been taught that they have experience, that there's just no time. It's just not utilitarian to actually pay attention to each person's individual striving towards the topic, which is a terrible tragedy, because in every person is the ability for the concept to become new. And so for me, this chapter is really important for how we go forward in education and caring about that, you know, the desire of a child to know and to learn exists, and it is there, and it shouldn't be stifled. I mean, and it's interesting because it does kind of redeem that desire of wanting to know good and evil and all of that. It really does. And I wanted to say something else. Oh, and for yourself, I mean, we can't blame it all on the institution, but we can take this as an exercise for ourselves. So when we learn anything, to pay as much attention as possible and to take genuine interest, because we know that genuine interest is developing and strengthening our desire and it towards our wholeness. Yeah, so this book is an amazing task because it is kind of a slog sometimes, and it's very precise and very, you know, it can feel sort of like calculus to go through. And I think Steiner is like that all throughout. I mean, people really like his other lectures and his books about, you know, these amazing revelations of angels and demons and history that we can't touch and we can't see in this world. But this book tells us, no, we must take interest in what is in front of us. And that is why I love it so much. And that is why I will be, you know, an evangelist of this book to anyone who likes Steiner, because if you just take all of that, all of the wealth that he gives outside, you know, in his clairvoyant science, without this, you don't have the ability to see that it is possible for you to see the wholeness of the world in yourself, that you must, you know, we have to listen to gurus because they have the clairvoyant capacities. And that's just, it annoys me very much. Yeah, so yeah, this chapter was so kind to me because I was such a pessimist as a teenager, and I believed that the world was suffering, even though I couldn't understand why I loved the world so much as well. So I really enjoyed this chapter, and I've really enjoyed listening to everyone, and thanks for your attention and your interest.
Thank you, Kate. I can relate to what you just described. I think the first time I read this, I just felt so grateful for the clear articulation of, you know, like just this, and also a kind of affirmation of what, at least for me, you know, especially when I was in like kind of exploring different philosophies, you know, existentialism and you know, different, I guess, world philosophies, but just this sort of insistent desire, really, in the soul to like want to like live a full life and to like live to affirm life. Anyway, Jeff, what are you thinking?
Wait, can I say one more thing? Can I
Yeah.
say one more thing? Sorry, I know there's a lot of people that want to speak, but that desire that you want to affirm life, that is the reason why out of all the philosophies I've come into and ideologies that I've believed and taken up as a teenager, like anthroposophy is the most important one because it gives you the longest path, you know, there's no dead end and there's no thing that you just have to give up at the end and go, I guess, you know, there's some things we can't know. But anthroposophy is like, no, you can know it, just go down. And that's why it's so good for the soul.
Amen. Yeah, keep striving, right? Yeah. Jeff?
Yeah, I'm going to try to forge a couple of connections here. One of them is immediate and obvious. I'll start with that. And that is, you know, one of the main, we've been talking all in and around this. One of the main points in chapter 13 is you're getting out of this utilitarianism, pessimism, you know, out of this, you know, just trying to weigh like on a balance, you know, pleasure and pain, and is life worth it, and all that stuff. Instead, and this has been pointed out already today, but he points out that's not the calculus. It's really the individual desire, right? So that's where we're not measuring, how painful is that going to be, but is that, we don't wake up in the morning saying, I guess I need 13 units of pleasure today, better get busy, but we're striving for something specific. So what I want, the first connection I want to make is going back to chapter 9, where one of its key points is, this whole question of acting out of love, right? Do you love your deed and your action? This kind of ethical individualist calculus, it's kind of the wrong word, but I'm just continuing our vocabulary here, is what is your love function? What is your desire function? Which is very, very individual. That's why we can't prescribe to a population on a utilitarian basis, because you're dealing with a whole bunch of individuals, not a group. There is no group in that sense. So anyways, that's the obvious connection with this key point of chapter 13 and chapter 9. And let's see if I can pull this off. The other connection I want to make is still on this question of what your individual desire is, the love function. I'm going to go out into a little bit of a different area outside of Steiner, and in the work of Wilhelm Reich, he solved one of the problems that Freud left, and that problem is the problem of masochism. And this is, of course, we're in the psychological realm here, but Freud's solution was the concept of the death instinct, right? He postulated this death instinct, and actually that dovetails very nicely into what Matt brought up earlier around the antinatalists, right? This idea that either we want to, or we should want to, just destroy ourselves and end life and all this kind of thing. But as I say, Reich solved that problem, because that was incorrect, and Reich got to the bottom of masochism. And I won't go into a big technical explanation of this, but the bottom line of what Reich came to is that you dig down into the core of the human being. Like Freud, let's put it this way, Freud did not get all the way to the bottom, right? He dug down somewhat and got to this answer of the death instinct, but Reich dug further, and he said, no, that's wrong. At the core of the human being is this innate love impulse, this innate, like our desire function, all the things we talk about here in philosophy of freedom. But yeah, Reich, as I say, he overturned that death instinct, which I think is very important to what we're talking about today as well. So I hope that adds something. I hope it makes some sense, but maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Jeff. Max?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to pick up on the thread that Jeff and Kate were spinning, and maybe also just weave it together with the way Steiner ends the chapter about he's trying to lay out like what is possible for a human being at the extent of its evolution, and not kind of get arrested at what are earlier stages along that path. He says the goal was to demonstrate the possibility of freedom, and freedom does not appear in acts. Excuse me. He says, but I have not tried to show here what must be impressed on an unevolved human being, but rather what lies within the nature of a human being at the end of its evolution. This is something that I've often contemplated with education. We often reduce education to the exchange of information or propositional content. And I can speak from my experience here, what is really needed and what students are really craving is actually these contact with evolved human beings in this way, like somebody who has reached the extent of his or her moral capacity. And that's the really transforming force. And so I think in a way, it's bad news because it's bad news because we have there's so few I guess incentives there's these discussions are so rare, I guess, in our time. But on the other hand, it's good news because once we're clear about the goal, then it's a question of setting forth and striving toward it.
Daniel?
Yeah, thanks everybody. yeah, I guess I was spurred to talk about what Kate said about the AI, and that we're so much looking outside of ourselves for results and trying to get to where we think we already know where we were trying to go, that the real issue is what's happening inside the human. And that I think what we're saying is that we have it wired that striving is hard. But I think someone was saying the idea that striving and hope go together. Like our striving is our hope, and that striving is what happens for the human. I've often thought that all the negative death impulses that we're seeing around us, to see them as a call for us to come forth and match it. It's like, come on, this is where we are called to be, and we can be. Like, as bad as things are, is how good whatever the spirit knows we can be. And I often think when I'm in like a sweat lodge with Native American, there's a kind of almost a mantra of like, life is good, God is good, my life is good. And I think that we're living in a world right now with a mantra that it's not good, that the pessimism is all around us. And I had an experience the other day where I was in a very negative place, and I was able to switch the framing of, not because when I'm in a negative place, I'm thinking it's always going to be negative. The whole world is negative. I suck. And when I switched it to, this is just an element in a good world, it was able to transform. So I almost want to like testify how, if we can really believe or even just try out that idea of goodness, that's the ultimate utilitarian thing to think. But we often forget that the frame is, what frame we're coming from, that the pessimism is leaking into us. And then thus, even the idea of calculating for results is demeaning to our human role. That's all I know I had something else, but that's all I wanted to add.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I think especially with regard to all the, the fear around technology and even, climate change, that these can be invitations to our striving and to what we can become. Angus?
Yeah, gonna try and come back to the exercises you can do, but I'm gonna have to tell you how I got there. So Kate was talking about ChatGPT, artificial intelligence, and one possible angle on that is working in education myself. You might see it from the light of, perhaps it will actually destroy that education system, and in that sense it has a positive intent. Who knows? Okay, it's going to lead to a significant shake-up within education, even though countries like Italy are already trying to ban it. Germany's got legislation on the books to try and ban it as well in Germany. Really interesting times. But intelligence per se isn't bad. Intelligence can be, it is what we need to make good decisions. The realm that our inner lives that intelligence lives in is like hugely important. I'm going to come specifically back to Daniel's point in a minute, but the list that I'm just about to give, I've learnt very quickly, it doesn't take long to use ChatGPT in a smart way. I can program it so that it gives me the type of responses that I'm looking for. I can tailor it, and anybody can do this. It really just takes a few minutes to do. So if I put in the question, sort of like, what moral exercises what exercise does Steiner recommend for developing moral imagination? And I've already told it you're going to restrict yourself uniquely to anthroposophical content of the lectures. Don't give me any of the stuff, anything modern psychology. Not interested. I can do that. And then what does it come up with? A great big long list of wonderful things that we can go and experiment with. Here are some of them. Studying works of art, studying literature, practicing art, Imagine sacrificing time or energy for somebody. I did something like that this week inadvertently with a positive result. Inner truthfulness, learning to know what are our real motivations for doing things. Reverence for life, nature, other people. Specifically thinking of Daniel here, empathy for other people's situations. By putting ourselves in other people's souls, we're creating a mental flexibility which gives us the ability to step outside our habitual way of thinking. And you just gave a wonderful example of how that becomes empowering. That was my personal reading of what you were saying. Gratitude and practicing acts of kindness. That's all been served up to me by intelligence, artificial intelligence. It's not bad in the right hands. This is powerful stuff. This is really powerful stuff. So powerful, it might even...
It might even what? My computer froze. What did you say? It might even what? Or what did you say?
Its current form.
Oh, for some reason my internet's unstable over here. Chad, thanks for sharing that, Angus. That was great.
Yeah, thanks so much, Angus. That's really a positive understanding of how ChatGPT can be really helpful. I just want to thank everyone for their comments. It was really moving what you said, Jeff and Kate. Your ideas are really, really spot on. And Daniel, what made me think of was I approached a lot of things through the archetypal astrological perspective, but also Stan Groff's cartography, which is based around the perinatal experience, moving from conception through the birth process and through delivery. And what happens is the contractions force this, intense experience, and then you move through the birth canal as the cervix dilates, and it's a death rebirth struggle, and then birth moves you into a completely new reality. And I think we can understand the evolution of consciousness, but the human situation, like the Earth situation, in that just that way, which is, it's 2 million years of hunter-gatherer situation, and then the last 50,000 years of just civilization, like growing food and having larger and larger cities, and now we have 8 billion people, whereas we just had thousands of people for 2 million years, and now we have extremely amount of people that are pushing the threshold of what the environment with the Earth can contain, and conceptualizing the Earth as the womb. It's the success of the growth of the fetus. It's the success of the growth of the fetus in the womb that triggers the contractions. And it seems as though it's success of the growth of the human being that's triggering the contractions from the environment, from the Earth, to hopefully birth a new human being out of this process. That it's the mechanistic, scientific, imperialistic, extractive, modern human being that has to die. It has to go through a descent in order for a new individuated whole human being to be born into a new world, hopefully. So it makes sense, like, why we can see everything as pessimistic, because there's so much loss, and we're not connected to soul and spirit and the divine, and we're trapped in this mechanistic exploitive process. But maybe there's a much larger telos at work, and ultimately I have a lot of gratitude for the astrological perspective, because it has an empirical dimension that demonstrates a sacred reality that connects the interior and the exterior, the inner soul and the world, the unifying redemptive potential there. But yeah, I really appreciate this chapter, and everyone's contributions, just really excellent. I feel like we're on the threshold of an awakening here. I don't know, that's kind of what left me with. So yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Chad. That feels like a great way to end the session for today. And yeah, I agree. This has been such a great cycle, reading the book together so far. I'm very grateful for everybody's participation and insight and depth. All right, well, next week, reading The Consequences of Monism, right? No, Individuality and Genus, sorry. All right, thanks everybody.
An important chapter. Yeah, thanks everyone so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye. Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.
Presta.
Yes.